All right, hey everybody, welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about Budbreak and Canopy management in vineyards. And for a textbook reference, you can check out the Grape Grower's Handbook, Chapter 10, primarily for this one. Additional reading will be chapters 12 and 14 from General Viticulture. Okay, so tonight's presentation is relatively straightforward. We're going to talk about canopy management, how to assess canopy characteristics and techniques for vineyard canopy management, and then also indirect canopy management techniques. So last presentation was all about dormancy, if you remember correctly. So now we're kind of following the cyclical nature of the vineyard. We're going from dormancy, moving towards bud break, and then that very extreme growth that we see after bud break and how to manage the canopy. So the following presentation will be all about fertilizers and irrigation, so stay tuned for that, and then we'll just kind of keep going with pest management and so forth. So yeah, so canopy. Today is all about canopy. So why manage a grapevine canopy? Well, we want to optimize the yield that we have of fruit, the fruit quality itself. We want to reduce the risks of disease and also facilitate other vineyard operations as well. So whether you're working in a vineyard purely by hand or you have some mechanized equipment too, it'll benefit you for everything to be more uniform, and it'll help downstream processes. Okay, so how do we manage the canopy? We're going to look at shoot positioning, shoot thinning. We're also going to look at hedging, leaf removal, and cluster thinning are going to be the big ones. So why is this important, right? Big picture, and this is very repetitive, what we've already talked about in this class, like why sunlight is so important to grapevines, and also pest pressures and airflow and all this stuff, right? So it's important to manage the canopy because, one, improves light interception. So light coming in, hitting the fruit, will help sugar accumulation, acid composition, bud development, fruit set, berry growth. On the other side of that, too much shading can negatively affect your crop levels, right? The phenolic compounds are going to accumulate much nicer in the red grape varieties if they have sunlight versus ones that don't. It'll also reduce your levels of methoxypyrazine. So that's like the bell pepper or like vegetal characteristics that we get sometimes in varieties. So it can help reduce that. It can also help improve the development of aroma and flavor compounds. And then open canopies are generally less humid, which prevent disease pressures, right? So better penetration of any applications that you're using, foliar applications, whether it's a fungicide or insecticide, that's also going to help, right? So just numerous benefits to why you should manage your canopies and how it relates to the health of your vine. Cool, so the part one we're going to look at for canopy management is how it relates to the microclimate of your vineyard, right? So microclimate will consist of the solar radiation, temperature, wind speed, humidity, and evaporation. This is all pretty straightforward. These are concepts we've touched on briefly in this class already. So if you have any questions, we can talk more about it if you'd like. So anytime you do any de-leafing, you take any grapes off, you do cluster thinning, or any other canopy work that you do, all of these components are affected when we manage the canopy of the vine. So the amount of solar radiation, the temperature of the canopy, etc. Right on down the list. Cool. So then we have the difference between macroclimate and microclimate, just in case you're not quite sure what that is. So microclimate, we're talking about either a single vine, a block, a smaller vineyard, or even a hillside that vines are planted on. It just really depends on the context of whoever's talking about it is using that word. Then we have macroclimate, which we talked about. Our Winkler index is like a much larger index of the climate of a region, right? So climate 5 versus climate, or region 5 versus region 1, etc. Those are very broad distinctions of a region, but we know that there are microclimates within that, and then even smaller climates within those microclimates, right? So a lot of complexity. It's not just black or white. Okay, part 2 is assessing canopy characteristics. So how do you determine like if your canopy is too thick or not thick enough, right? Do you have enough foliage? Do we not have enough foliage? So there's a couple ways to determine that, and that's the density of your shoots, the leaf layer number, the shoot length, and then also the lateral shoot development. So there's a primary shoot that comes off of the vine, and any shoots that come off of that are lateral shoots. So shoot density is quite literally the number of shoots per linear foot of canopy. So a lot of training systems involve cordons for vines. These are the arms that come out from the trunk, right? So we have 2 cordons here. The shoot density is literally how many shoots are left on that cordon. So you can see this side of the cordon has been thinned, and this is what it looks like unthinned. So the vine will just grow like a crazy bush on its own. That's why we have to go up and clean this up. So if you take a closer look in this top picture, you'll have to go through and remove some of these shoot positionings to provide nice space, airflow, right, and giving it the proper space to grow. So this is best done early on when this is still really green and they're really easy to peel off. The vegetation's very soft, so you can just go through with your hands and just peel off any shoots that are undesired. So there's 2 extremes to this, right? If you have too low of a number of shoots, you'll have an unnecessarily open canopy, and then also you'll lose what could have been fruit. So loss of yield potential. If there are too many shoots, then you can have excessive shading and then poorly illuminated leaves and fruit. So all about balance, right? So shoot density is one of the ways that we do that. Next, we're going to talk about leaf layer number. So shoot density is really dealt with much earlier in the season when all these shoots are still young and also very small. Leaf layer number has to do much later in the season when we've already developed fruit, started to develop fruit, right? And the canopies are most completely full at this point, right? So leaf layer number is going to tell you the density of your canopy by using what's called the point quadrant method. So what we're doing here, and we have a video attached here on this next slide that this really nice lady goes over how to do this method. She uses a small rod and inserts it into the canopy of the fruiting zone specifically. And then you have to count the number of contacts made with every time you insert that rod. So if you're pushing it through the fruiting zone and you're like, okay, I touched a leaf, a cluster, and then another leaf as I went through that, then you have to record that data. You'll get some percentages, and then you can determine like the percentage of leaf versus grape versus even gaps that you had, right? So if you didn't touch a leaf or a cluster, it would be a gap. We're going to talk about that a little more on the next slide. So only measure the fruiting zone. It's important because that's where your density really matters, because you want to control like the humidity, the pest pressures around the cluster, right? So we're not so concerned with the rest of the canopy. It's just the fruiting zone. Okay. And then if you would like to get a good number that's representative of your whole block or your whole vineyard, you have to get lots of data, right? So 50 to 100 for 50 for like a smaller vineyard block, 100 for a larger block. It just depends on the size that you're working with. So determine your leaf layer numbers, right, for density of your canopy. You would have the annotations for the parts that your rod touched going through the canopy, right? So L would be leaf, C would be cluster, and G would be gap. So when the rod passes through the canopy without touching a leaf or cluster, that's considered a gap. And then touching shoots doesn't count, right? Because we're trying to just measure the foliage. So ideal numbers, we have 20 to 40% should be gaps. Your leaf layer number should be 1 to 1.5 or less. Percent interior leaves should be less than 10%, and your percent interior bunches should be less than 40%. So this is a very specific calculation that's outlined in the Grape Grower Handbook. Go to page 102. There's a little gray box at the bottom of the page that has calculation examples on there. So if you'd like to perform this in your own personal vineyard at home, you can go through and look at that. Also, this in like the teal blue color here, this is a link to a YouTube video with this nice professor at Oregon State University She goes over the process very nicely for how to determine your leaf layer number. She goes through and shows you how she does that. So you can look more into that. Cool. Okay, the next thing you can do to assess the character of your canopy is the shoot length, right? So we've talked to this, the third thing we talked about. So first talked about shoot density, then your leaf layer number, and now onto shoot length. So the length itself should be an indication of the character, right? So generally speaking, if you are on a low cordon system like VSP, which is vertical shoot positioning, you should be 13 to 15 nodes long. So every like alternating leaf here and everywhere there's a little node, 13 to 15 of those. If you have shorter than that, they're too short of a shoot, you won't have enough leaf area to ripen the fruit on the shoot. And then if you have extremely long shoots, it's excessive shade, excessive growth, right? But if you have a high cordon system, your shoots can be longer. Just depends on the pruning system that you have. Okay, if you have a lot of lateral shoots, kind of like what this arrow is pointing at here, so this is our main primary shoot that's coming off of the cordon. This is a lateral shoot that's just shooting out in the complete opposite way there. This is an indication of vigor in your canopy. If you have a very high number of lateral shoots, it could mean that you have very high vigor in your canopy. That can also result in excessive shading in your canopy. So smaller numbers are less detrimental, but they might help photosynthesize for your crops. Okay, on to part 3, which is techniques for how to manage that canopy. How can we work with it, alter it, so we can get the best experience, right? So 1 is hedging, 2 is leaf pulling, and then 3 is cluster thinning, also known as dropping crop. And leaf pulling can also be known as like suckering too. Okay, hedging. Hedging is to reduce any excess shoot growth. Top and or sides of the canopy. It can be done with an attachment on a tractor, much like this. It can be done by hand with a little hedging saw. If you've ever seen those, the people just use those and they just go right over the sides. Just helps to cut back any excess growth that is not needed. It won't directly reduce the vigor of your vines, but it can allow for some lateral shoot growth instead. It can happen as well. This is typically done early to midsummer, so once the vines have really fully fleshed out their full growth, then it's a trim back after that. It's a haircut. The shoots are typically trimmed back 6 to 8 inches above the top training wire, and then retaining only the nodes and leaves needed for adequate fruit and wood maturity. So that'll help. Leaf removal is typically done by hand. I believe there are some mechanical devices that can do it, kind of with like optical sorting techniques or recognition, but leaf removal is relatively easy, but again, it's just, there's so much work to be done in the vineyard. It takes many passes through before you're done for the season. It's not just you can plant it and walk away kind of thing. By no means, it's not like that. So leaf removal is typically done around the clusters, right? So we do that to allow sunlight and airflow. Generally, you want 40 to 60% exposure of the clusters, and you only typically do it on one side of the canopy. So it's only necessary to remove leaves from one side, known as the shade side. Unless you are in a cooler climate, then you would pull leaves from both sides. So where we are in California and the Sierra foothills, it does get quite hot still in our growing season. So we definitely have what's called a shade side and a sun side. So we'll talk more about that here. Okay, so when the sun comes in the morning, it's less intense and less hot. So you want that sun to touch your grapes because it will dry out any of the mildew or any moisture that was potentially on the fruit. That'll also give them some sun for the skins to develop colors and flavors, and then also for the vine to start photosynthesizing, right? Then as it moves into the afternoon, into the late afternoon when it's very intense, you want it to hit the most leafy side of the vine to protect the fruit from being sunburnt. And so that way those leaves can keep photosynthesizing the sun and creating sugars for the fruit, right? So whenever you're confused about sun side versus shade side, think about where the sun rises and where the sun falls, right? And then also it just really depends on the orientation of your rows, right? So there are east-west orientation vineyards, that go horizontally, and then in that situation you want the north side to be your shade side, and if you are in a north-south orientation, up and down, you would want your east side to be the shade side. So it gets a little confusing sometimes, but just think about where the sun rises, where the sun sets, and where you'd be, right? And then there are some people who are like, what would it be, northeast to southwest, right, or vice versa, so it gets a little complicated as to sun versus shade. But ultimately, you're trying to promote growth, prevent sunburn, prevent mildew formation, right? And other things too. So think about shade side versus sun side. Okay, cluster thinning is another thing you can do to help manage your canopy. Oftentimes, there are varieties that just overproduce. Zinfandel is a huge producer. This is a picture we have at Boger Winery from our vineyard work when we dropped crop of Zinfandel. So we dropped about 50% in this photo. It just depends on the variety and what your goals are for production, right? So why are we dropping crop? We're trying to achieve balance between the fruit and the canopy growth and to produce the most optimal fruit, right? So it can be used to remove any underset or poorly matured clusters. So if things are just not looking great, you can trim back, those ones. It can help reduce bunch rot and tight clustered varieties. So some varieties have what they call the architecture of the cluster. Very tight, highly compacted great berries will have a much more likelihood of developing noble rot or bunch rot than ones that are really loose and kind of aired out that a lot of airflow can get through. So this can be a way to help get more airflow in that area in general. You're going to want to make sure that you thin the crop uniformly. It doesn't benefit you to just remove all the clusters from a single shoot or even a single arm or a section of that arm, the cordon. But generally, a rule of thumb is 1 to 2 clusters left per shoot. But again, it depends on the variety, the uniformity of your clusters ripening on shoots as well. So it's best to do this before veraison, so that way you're not wasting sugar content in the grapes, right? Because once veraison hits, that's when sugar starts to accumulate. Okay, part 4, indirect canopy management. So for this, we're looking at ways to manage the canopy without directly touching the canopy. So we're looking at the vineyard floor, fertilization, and irrigation. So for vineyard floor management, this is really just mostly cover crops. The decision of what type of cover crop to plant and can impact, it will help with nutrients and soil structure and help with against erosion, but also you can add a competitor in for water and nutrients as well, depending on what you plant. So if you are planting something that competes for nutrients, it can help to harness over vigorous vines, right? Cool. So that's the first main point. The main concerns of vineyard floor management is weed management and soil conservation, but we're really here to talk about cover crop. Okay, fertilization. So most vineyards will require some kind of fertilization, right? And there's macro fertilizers and micro fertilizers. Most macro fertilizers include nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. Micro fertilizers would be like micronutrients, right? So boron, iron, manganese, zinc, molybdenum. And then decision of when to apply can be required by visuals that you see, like the vines look stressed, the leaves are droopy, they're changing colors when they're not supposed to, or it could be vine tissue analysis. You send in a sample to a lab, right? So these are ways you can decide if you want to apply. If you have an excessive use of nutrients or fertilizers, it can cause overgrowth of the canopies and lower the sugar content in the fruit. Too little vigor or nutrients can cause less fruit set, right? So this is just a very broad general sweep of fertilization. Our next presentation will be exclusively on fertilizers and irrigation, so hold tight for that. And then for irrigation, right, this can help or hinder the ability of your canopies to grow, right? And it really depends on a lot of other factors too, right? So your soil type, the water holding capacity, rootstock, clone, etc., right? There's 100 different factors to take into account before knowing what irrigation is correct for you and your canopy management. So generally speaking, irrigation practices that utilize a water deficit can increase both the fruit yield and the quality. And there's 2 different management techniques for this that reduce water usage but increase fruit quality and optimize your canopy growth. And that's regulated deficit irrigation, also known as RDI, or partial root zone drying, which is PRD. But that, again, will be continued next lecture. We'll get more into detail for that, but it does manage your canopy. Okay. With that, we have our learning objectives. I feel like that was kind of fast, but hopefully pretty straightforward. If you guys have any questions, feel free to send me an email, and I will see you guys next time.